Okay, Sandra, we're going to go ahead and get started. A few reminders is the sessions will be recorded and shared about 2 weeks after the conference. Presentation and reference materials are available on the sessions landing page right underneath where you clicked join. Please use the Q&A box in Zoom to submit questions for Sandra. The chat is also available to share commentary or chat with other attendees, but questions posted in the chat will not get answered. So just a reminder to please use the Q&A box. And with that, I don't want to take any more of your time, Sandra, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let you take over. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I hope the conference is off to a good start for you. I'm going to jump right in because we have lots to talk about in the next hour. I've never been in the military, but I have had the experience of being in a few boot camp exercise classes, and they had a couple things that are in common with the session that we're going to have this afternoon. They were fast moving and they were intense. So we're going to cover a lot of ground over the next hour to give you some basics about grant writing that I hope will be real helpful and practical advice for you. I do want to mention that if this is a topic that you would like to have more information about, Siebert, in conjunction with some other foundations, is going to be offering a longer version of this training on Wednesday, the 17th of November. I think we're going to be starting at 9 a.m. It will be a virtual training, so I'm sure you'll be getting some more information about that. It will cover some of the same things we're covering today, but in a bit more detail. And it will also have a section on grant research. So if you are looking for other possible grant opportunities beyond just the Siebert Foundation, it'll give you some information about that as well. I also wanted to just mention that on the final slide, you will see my email address. And if there is a question that you have today that we don't get to, or if you're like me and you think of your question 5 minutes after the session ends, please feel free to email me and I will be happy to get back to you and do my best to answer your question. But as Michelle said, you can put questions in the Q&A and we will get to as many of them as we can. So what we're going to talk about today really are two primary things. First, we're going to take a look at the grant writing process as a 5-step writing process. It's the same kind of process that I teach when I teach business writing classes, but we will talk about it a little bit more specifically in terms of things to keep in mind with grant writing. And then we'll look at each section of a typical grant proposal. Grants are not all set up the same way, but that there is some common information that you usually are asked to address. And so we'll go through and talk a little bit about each of those major sections, and then we'll take some questions at the end if we have a little time left. So let's start by looking at the grant writing process and some things to keep in mind as you go through it. So the 5 steps we're going to talk about are, first of all, beginning with the end in mind, taking some time at the beginning of the process to kind of think things through a little bit and do a little planning. I think you'll find it pays off in the long run. Next, we look at gathering information that we need in order to write the grant, write a rough draft of the grant, revise it, and then proofread. So let's talk a little bit about each of these sections. So first of all, beginning with the end. Before you start to write any grant proposal, there's a couple things you should always do. One is to review information about the funder. Many funders have a website available. You can find information that way. Sometimes they put out a proposal, a request for proposals, and you can find information that way. In the session I'm going to do on the 17th, we'll get into more details about other ways of researching the funder, but that's certainly a place to start. Nothing, I think, makes people at foundations grumpier than having somebody call to ask questions or email questions about information that's easily available on the person's or on the foundation's website. So make sure you've checked that out first and you've done your homework. What does this organization fund? Who else have they funded? Who, you know, are there other people who've been funded who do work similar to what you do? Make sure you've checked that out, and then read the entire application before you start working on it. If it's an online application, I know CBERT has the application questions available right on their site, which is really nice. Sometimes you have to log in and set up an account, and then you can work through the questions. Some applications, of course, are still done via snail mail, so it may not be an online application, but you can get a printed copy then of the question. So make sure you've read everything over and that you're thinking about the purpose of each section of that application. So just as when you design a program, you start by figuring out what kind of change you're trying to create, and then you develop a roadmap to get there. Grant writing really starts with thinking about the overall proposal you're creating, and then figuring out how you're going to include the information that you think is most important and most persuasive. How are you going to build your case? So as you start looking through the application, you're starting to plan a little bit where different pieces of information are going to fit within that application. Many funders use a two-step process in which they start with a letter of inquiry, often referred to as an LOI. And then if your LOI kind of passes muster and they think that you might be a good candidate for funding, then you will be invited to write a full proposal. One of the nice things that CBERT does is that they are open to having conversations with organizations that are new to them. So if you are thinking about submitting an LOI after you've done the research that you can do on the website, you still think you're a good fit, then at that point, they would welcome a call from you. And I think that's a great opportunity that a lot of foundations don't provide. So I would certainly recommend taking advantage of it. And I would also say that if you have worked with CBERT before, but maybe you've got a brand new idea, it's a brand new program, something different that you are hoping to get funding for, it would be worth it to have a phone call with whichever program officer you've been working with and discuss that with them. So this first stage is just kind of doing some of this initial planning. Next, you want to gather information so that when you sit down to write, you have the information that you're going to need. So ask yourself a few questions. What kind of data will support this proposal? What kind of data can I use that will help to justify the need or justify the approach that we're taking to deal with a particular need? And where can I get that data? Is that internal data, or am I going to need to look outside of my organization or my church to find that data? Who can help me get the data that I need? One of the things that I was looking at the CBERT site the other day, and if you haven't poked around on that site recently, I'd encourage you to do that. There's some great data right on that site that could be helpful in terms of looking at, for instance, information about poverty. So there's a lot of different places that you can find data, but you need to kind of identify that and maybe find somebody who likes to do that kind of work who can help you. Even if you're doing the writing, it might be somebody else who can help you find some of the information that you need. And then if you're looking at a grant you've submitted before, whether it was to CBERT or some other foundation, do you need to update some of your data? This is one of the pet peeves that I have heard from program officers at multiple foundations, is that they feel sometimes as if people who are looking for funding are providing data that's really outdated, and they haven't bothered to update that. So that's something you want to be sure that you're not using, data that's 10 years old. Things change quickly. But gather that information, get that together, and then you write the rough draft of your proposal. And at this stage of the game, just forget about organizing things, just try to get the information down. I start wherever it's easiest for me to start. Whichever question I think is going to be easiest to answer, I usually start there. Doesn't matter if it's easier to write the end or the middle, especially with online applications. I've been told by numerous program officers that these applications aren't always read in the order that the questions appear. Some program officers just prefer to read a certain question first. And some, as I understand it, some applications aren't even printed out for the program officer's review in the same order that they appear on the application that you and I are filling out. So, you know, just make it easy on yourself and start wherever. Each answer really needs to pretty much stand independently anyway. Sometimes I just force myself to write for a set period of time. If you're a person who just really does not enjoy writing, and I know sometimes grant writing is something that people are asked to do, and it's not, you know, it's along with many other things that are a part of your job description. Sometimes just even forcing yourself to work for 10 minutes or 15 minutes before you take a break can be helpful. I have an iTunes playlist that I sometimes put on. It's about 40 minutes, and I tell myself I'm going to write as long as the songs are playing, and when it's over, then I'll let myself take a break. So sometimes playing those little games with ourselves can be helpful. After you get that rough draft written, then really comes what I think is the hardest part of working on any grant, and that is doing the revisions. I had a college professor who said there's no such thing as good writing, there's only good rewriting. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. Revising is almost always going to take more time than writing the initial grant. And this is also the time often when you can start to fine tune your response before entering it into an online application. And it will allow you to check your character or your word counts. So more and more applications are being submitted online. You're more and more likely to have an online application. I would never suggest typing your response right into that online application. I would always recommend that you have a Word document so that you can make changes, move things around. Sometimes you'll find that there's some information that you want to include and you're having trouble fitting it into a particular question. Maybe there's a way that you can fit it into a different question where you've got some characters or some words to spare. So doing it in Word allows you to easily check those word and character counts, and also then move things around if you need to. One other, something that I find people run into and are a little bit confused by with character counts if you're not used to working with those. In Word, when you get the character count, you'll actually get two different numbers. One is with spaces and one is without spaces. So obviously the one with the spaces is going to be a higher number. And I've yet to see an online application that didn't count the spaces. So they're going to count the spaces. And I've talked with so many people who put together a response. They thought, oh, the spaces must not count in that character count. And then they try to put that information into the grant, and the grant won't accept it because it's too long. Usually if your response is too long, it will tell you that and tell you it won't allow you to save it. I have worked on applications that simply cut off wherever that character or word count ends. They just don't, the rest of your response just doesn't get included. So you want to check that and make sure that everything it fits. One other just little tip, because some people still are, if you're as old as I am, you remember when you always put two spaces after a period. That goes back actually to typesetting days, the reason why we do that. And without getting into all the detail, the best practice now is only one space after a period. And that's going to save you a character. So you may find it hard to make the switch if you're used to two spaces, but you'll thank
Sandra,
me.
we lost your sound a little bit. I'm not sure if it's just me or for the rest of the participants, but
all right.
Oh, we got you back. There you go.
Okay. I don't know what that was. Do I need to repeat what I just said, Michelle?
Maybe just the last few sentences. It wasn't for long.
Okay. Well, just to say that when you're spacing after a period, you only need one space, not two. So that will save you some characters if you're struggling to get everything in. So again, revising is a really important part of the writing process. For me, when I am working with clients and I provide them with a draft of a grant, it's probably really my third or fourth draft before they are even seeing it. So this revision process is really important. And there's some questions you want to ask yourself as you're going through and making your revisions. Probably the first and most important one is my purpose clear? Would my proposal make sense to someone who doesn't know about this project or this program? So very often we are so in the weeds with the work that we do that we don't recognize that other people just don't have the same understanding of our work. Sometimes it's really helpful to ask someone who knows nothing about what you do to give you, some feedback on a proposal. Does it make sense to them when they read it? Do they understand exactly what it is that you're doing? We make assumptions without meaning to, but you want to be sure that someone else is going to be able to understand us. Have I been as brief? Oops, whoops. Have I been as brief as possible while still conveying adequate information? Most of us have a tendency to either say too much or too little. We're either very wordy or we maybe don't like writing, so we're so brief as to not give enough explanation. And I think if you just know kind of which side of that continuum you fall on, you can try to be mindful of that. And make sure that as you're rereading your draft, you're looking at, did I give enough information to explain this? Did I use a lot of words I didn't need? And with so many grants now limiting us in terms of words and character counts, I think the good thing about that is it forces us somewhat to be a bit more concise and careful as we're writing. Another question to ask in your draft is, have I formatted the proposal in a way that makes it easy to read? It's hard to format with online proposals sometimes, and you have to be careful because the formatting in Word may not carry over into the online proposal. So take a look at that. Sometimes the online proposal will have its own formatting tools available. But if nothing else, make sure you don't have paragraphs that go on for 27 lines. Make sure you've got a little white space in there, that some things are listed out in list form rather than in narrative, just to break up the reading for the person who's reading it. This is the person that you want to be on your side, and you want them to hang in there with you and read everything you've written. So you want to try to make that as easy as possible for the person who's doing that review. Is my proposal free of spelling, punctuation, word usage, grammatical errors? For some of us, this just isn't our strength. So this is where having someone else help you with a revision might be good. Ask somebody else who's good at this stuff to take a look at it. But if a proposal comes in with a lot of mistakes, that especially easy things that probably were caught or could have been caught in spell check, it ends up reflecting on your proposal, and beyond that, it reflects on you, but it also reflects on your organization. If you are new to a funder, all they know about you and your organization is what's in that proposal. And if the proposal looks like it was done in a hurry or it's sloppy, then by extension, they may question whether or not the work you do would also be sloppy and not as attentive to detail as it should be. So you want to make sure you're not downgrading your proposal simply because of some easy errors that could have been fixed. This is one that I find a lot of organizations have difficulty with. Have I used acronyms or other jargon that might be unfamiliar to my audience? Again, we forget that other people aren't as familiar with our field or with our organization as we are. And most organizations have internal jargon. Maybe it's initials. Maybe you don't call a program by its full name, but you use the three initials in the program's title. Other people don't have that information, and simply putting it down in your proposal and explaining it on first reference is not necessarily enough, because now the person reading it, you've used maybe 3 or 4 different terms like that, and they can't keep them all straight, and they have to go back and they have to look and find, where did you explain what that particular set of initials meant. Again, this is how you get grouchy program reviewers or program officers, and we don't want them to be grouchy when they're reading our proposals. So make sure you're being careful about the use of acronyms or jargon. I find a lot of my clients really struggle with this, and often they're trying to shorten things up. They want to use fewer words or fewer characters. But if you're going to create a misunderstandings or difficulty in understanding, you're kind of defeating your purpose. And then finally, at the end of the revision process, to just say to yourself, have I missed anything? Go back to that planning you did in the first step, the beginning with the end. What were some of the things that you felt like you really wanted to be sure you could capture within this proposal? Are they all there? Is there something else that you need to include? Is there a story or a real life example that you could use? Sometimes, and I know Siebert does this, which I very much appreciate, some funders will allow you to attach some additional documents, and that can be a great place to put a case study or a story about a client who's been helped, about a student, whatever it might be. But to make sure that there isn't anything you kind of haven't had a chance to say yet that you think is important to include. One of the things I like to do, if I don't have space to have a whole long story about a particular person who's been served, is to use quotes from clients who've benefited from a particular program. Maybe we've done a survey or we've had a focus group, but in some way we've captured some of that. And that can be a real short, quick way. Doesn't take a lot of words, a lot of characters, but it can really help to get through the message of what this program means to the people who are benefiting from it. So that's something you might want to consider. So finally, our 5th step in this process is to proofread. And this is so important, and it's why you don't want to be writing a grant, if at all possible, at the last minute. I know lots of us procrastinate, but when you do things at the last minute, you don't have that chance to just sit back and give yourself a little break before you actually submit your document. I always recommend that you try to take a break before you proofread, even if it's only just for a few minutes. If it's long enough to go fill up your coffee cup and get rid of that last cup of coffee that you had. I live in a condominium where the lobby is a kind of a long distance from my front door, and sometimes I just walk down to the lobby to get the mail and come back. And it's amazing how often then when I take a look at the grant again, things jump out at me and I see those mistakes. Make sure you're reading slowly, saying each word in your mind. Even better than that is to actually just read aloud. One of my clients is a woman who's completely blind. So when she's listening to a draft of something I've sent her, she's using the voice on her computer to do that. And it's amazing how often she finds those little mistakes I make when I leave out the word the, or I say, in instead of on, those easy mistakes. Because when you are proofreading something that you've written, you know what it's supposed to say, and it's easy to miss those things. So sometimes asking someone else to proofread is helpful, because you know what you meant to write, but that isn't always what we've actually written. And then lastly, do make use of spelling and grammar checking tools. That's another advantage of doing your proposal in Word before you transfer it into an online application, is that you will be able to make use of those tools. They're not perfect, but they have some limitations, but at least they send the message that this is something you need to take another look at and see, is this a spelling error? I know, the spell check doesn't recognize every word, and sometimes it doesn't exactly follow the grammar. So it's recommending you make a change that you shouldn't make, but they are helpful as a tool to try to spot some of those errors. So that's kind of the overview of just the process, the 5 steps that are involved. We are going to take a look more specifically at the different parts of the grant proposal. But Michelle, I'm just wondering, do we have any questions that relate to these 5 steps that we should address now before we move on?
We don't at this time, but if anyone has questions, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A. And Sandra, just to give a little bit of my feedback as a senior program officer for Siebert Lutheran Foundation, really appreciate
Absolutely.
sharing all that information, because it's spot on, and it's really all those things that you shared are really helpful for program officers when they're reading your applications. So thank you.
Okay, great. Well, let's move on then and talk about the grant proposals themselves. And we'll take a look kind of section by section. As I mentioned earlier, not every proposal is going to be set up the same way, but these are typically some of the things that you will be asked to address when you're writing a grant proposal. So there usually are going to be some questions about organizational background. Some online applications or some funders will actually have you set up kind of a profile that includes a lot of this background information, because often this is information that doesn't change real often, so they may not ask you for it for every grant, and they keep it in a profile. In my experience, most funders will ask you for some of these questions. So the first thing is, you often get asked for a history of your organization. You know, this is one of those things that you probably can cut and paste with a few maybe minor changes from grant to grant. I know with a number of my clients, we have a couple different versions of the history, because we have the 75-word version and we have the 200-word version based on who the funder is. And the other thing is that, you know, even the way the history is presented, there may be some things, if I'm doing a grant for the Siebert Lutheran Foundation, I'm going to want to play up the Lutheran history of an organization that's looking for funding that maybe with another funder would not be so important to mention, or at least maybe not to mention in as much detail. So even with the history section, you may need to do some modifying from grant to grant. Often you'll be asked for your mission statement, which most organizations have one. And sometimes you also might be asked if you have a vision statement. And I just want to talk real briefly about that and the difference between the two things. If you go on to the Siebert site, you can actually look at what their vision and mission is, and you'll see an example of this. Vision is broad. Vision is the big picture. Vision is beyond just your organization, beyond just your church or your school or, you know, the nonprofit that you work in. It's something bigger. Mission is more about how does your organization fit into that vision. So I'll give you an example from the blindness organization that I work with. Their vision is that everyone has access to the printed word. Everyone has access to the printed word. That's huge. That's big. Their piece of that is that they provide alternative ways for people with print disabilities to read. So they do audio and braille transcription so that people who are blind or visually impaired can read. It's part of this bigger mission that everyone has access to the printed word. So there's a difference between vision and mission, and just want you to be aware of that if you get asked that. You often will be asked some kind of a question that relates to client and community support. What evidence do you have of that? So again, you might need to think about that. What kind of data could I use to show that? It might be the numbers of people who participate in a program. It might be retention rates. How long do people stay involved in the program that you're offering, or how you know, do students in your school stay from first grade through 8th grade? What percentage actually follow through all of that time? Maybe you've done a survey and you've got, you know, data from clients about how they feel about a particular program. Maybe you've had focus groups and you can gather information there. But think about how you can demonstrate that clients in the community. And when I say client here, we could be talking about people who are members of your congregation. We could be talking about students in the school. The word client is meant sort of generically here to cover whoever it is that your program is serving. And then you might get asked questions about leadership, and that could be staff leadership or board leadership or both, especially if an organization is new. If you are a fairly young organization, it's going to be really important to show that the organization's leaders, staff, and board, have a track record that they already have accomplished certain things that lead you to be confident that they're going to be able to accomplish new things within your organization. So their track record would be important. So these are all different types of questions that you might get asked in terms of organizational background. The second key area that you almost always will see in grant proposals is that you will have questions around a problem or a need statement. Why is your program needed? And so the problem or the need statement needs to be compelling, because if the funder isn't sold on the need, then your project description doesn't really make a whole lot of difference. It can be a great project, but if there doesn't really seem to be a need for it, it's just kind of a nice thing to do, then that's probably not going to sit real well with your potential funders. So I'll give you an example. I was on the board of directors of a campus ministry program at UW Milwaukee a few years ago, and we offered a meal program once a week. And while we were doing the meal program and speaking to students, we had many students who told us that that meal was typically, that meal on Wednesdays was the only time they ate on Wednesdays, and that meal was also the best meal that they had all week. And as we started to survey students and saw there were many students who were actually met the definition of being food insecure, we started to look for funders so that we could start a food pantry for students at UWM. We had a hard time in the beginning with funders understanding that was actually an issue for students. There was a tendency to think that, students really aren't, well, sure, students are hungry because they're, because everybody who's in their early 20s, eats a lot and, has a high metabolism. But really, they're not really food insecure. If they would budget their money better and not spend it all on technology, there was a lot of, kind of misconceptions about that we really had to explain to people that food was probably one of the few things in their budget that wasn't a set amount. They had to pay their tuition, they had to pay their rent, and yeah, they had to pay for internet because you really need technology in order to go to school. So we had to do some educating and have some good data that we had collected to make sure that it was very clear why there was a need for this particular program. So again, data comes into play very much in your problem or need statement. It might be your own data. It might be data about the community where you live, where you're located, data regarding the people that you're going to be serving. So you want to try to find what can help to support your problem or need statement, and really emphasize local data over national data. National data is not going to be nearly as meaningful because a lot of things are different in different places. And so you want to try to have local data. I mentioned earlier, the Siebert website has some great data on it. Another website I would suggest checking out is census.gov. Census information is starting to come out now from the 2020 census, but there's a lot of different ways to drill down on data through this website, and they do offer workshops, and they offer a lot of just online tools that can help you find what you need. What a lot of people don't realize is that between the big census years, every 10 years, there's something called the American Community Survey, which is an ongoing survey that provides yearly information about the country and the people in the country. And this information is, because it's not based on as large of a sample size as trying to reach every person in the country, it's going to have a little bit of a potential that the numbers might be a little bit off one way or another. There's a margin of error there, but it still can give you some really good data. I use it a lot for zip code data if I'm working with a program that's in a particular zip code or serving people from certain zip codes, and you can find a lot of information there. So these are all just some examples of ways that you can find the data that will support your need statement. So you want to be sure that you have a strong need statement. The third thing that you will almost always find in a grant is a program or project description. And this is really kind of where the meat of what it is that you're doing comes through. So this is where you're going to be answering the who, what, where, when, how questions. Hopefully you've already answered the why question in your need statement, although there might be a why question here in terms of why did you choose this particular program or project to address that need that you have identified. So this is where you want to get into those specific kinds of questions. Who are you going to serve? There's often a demographics question as a part of your program or project description. And what are you going to do? What are the activities going to be that you're going to actually carry out, and on what timeline? So especially if it's a new program, well, how are you going to roll this out? When are you going to do various things? So one of the things, couple of things that are really important in this program or project description. First of all, make sure that you tie the need and the program together if it's not obvious. So, obviously if your need is about you're documenting how much hunger there is in a given community and you're going to provide a food pantry, there's a pretty clear connection there between your program and what the need is. But sometimes it's not that obvious how your project or program meets that particular need. Or how the other thing you're looking at here is how does this tie in with the funder's priorities? You want to be sure that you're running a program that fits within the priorities of what the funder wants to fund. So going back again to the blindness organization I work with, we have often pursued grants related to literacy. It is not always apparent to funders who provide funding for literacy programs that Braille is a part of a literacy program, that learning Braille and having access to Braille is what makes a blind person literate. Because without Braille, which is a written form of language, you don't have punctuation, you don't know the difference between bear aspirin, bear arms, and teddy bear. If you can't punctuate, you can't write. And so there's a connection between Braille and literacy that's not always readily apparent, that we have to make sure that we explain. So you can't assume that these things are going to be clear to your funders, because sometimes they aren't. The other thing, and this is perhaps one of the most important takeaways, I think, from our hour together, is try to resist the temptation to use a lot of flowery language when you are describing what your program does. I cannot tell you how many times program officers have said to me, I read proposals and I get to the end and I don't know what they actually do. I don't understand what the program actually is. So let me just kind of give you an example of this kind of language. And somehow we have this idea that that's how we're supposed to write. We're supposed to sound, we need to make things sound flowery and important and use lots of jargon. So we have, our program is going to enhance the academic potential of disadvantaged youth through involvement in individualized skill-based learning in areas of identified educational deficits. So what this program actually does is it provides one-to-one tutoring in math and reading to students who are below grade level. So think about the difference between those two descriptions. Enhance the academic potential of disadvantaged youth through involvement in individualized skill-based learning in areas of identified educational deficits. You read that, you don't really know that this is a tutoring program. It's for kids who are below grade level. It's focusing on math and reading. So make sure you're just explaining it in plain language. People are not looking for you to put this in all kinds of flowery language. This is another one of those times when you might want to use some stories or some examples, if that helps to make your examples to people a bit clearer. Remember, you're explaining this to someone who doesn't live and breathe it every day as you do. Another example I can give you with one of my own clients that was working with people who had been incarcerated and were trying to find employment. And we talk about the fact that there are barriers to employment. And And I happened to be sitting in this client's office one day when he took a phone call. And then based on the phone call, I asked him some questions afterwards. And he was explaining to me a situation where this individual had been offered, somebody who had come out of prison, they'd been offered a job. In order to get the job, they had to provide their birth certificate so they could show that they were, that they could work, and that they were actually a citizen and could work. But in order to get the birth certificate was from another state where they had been incarcerated, and that state would not release a birth certificate because this person still owed restitution. Well, they couldn't pay restitution unless they could get a job, and they couldn't, they couldn't get the job without getting the birth certificate. So it was one of these classic sort of catch-22s. Well, an example like that makes it much clearer the types of barriers that people who've been incarcerated face. To just simply say people face barriers is one thing, and then to explain this kind of catch-22, I think is a lot more powerful. So if you can, try to work those things into your program as well. Okay, so again, this is often the part of the grant where you're going to be allowed the most space. So you want to be sure that you really do justice to your program and explain it. Again, think about explaining it to someone who knows nothing about it, to whom this is all brand new information. Okay. The fourth area, and the next to the last area that I want to talk about, is the area of outcomes and evaluation. This is often one of the most difficult questions to answer when writing grants, because we haven't always thought this through real well, or we're not quite sure how we're going to measure outcomes. We need to be accountable for how we're going to use money, and funders need to be accountable too. They also want to be sure that they are investing their money in programs and projects that are going to have a return, that are going to do what they say they're going to do. Outcomes have to be measurable, or we can't evaluate them. So outcomes can't be too broad. They can't be too, we're going to make the world a better place. We have to narrow things down enough that we can actually measure them. And we shouldn't look at outcomes as just something that we have to do this because the funder's making us do it, but it should be a tool for measuring, is our work successful, and how do we continuously improve what we're doing and find ways to do things better? How do we plan for the future? I think often what happens with outcomes is that we measure whatever is easiest to measure. And the problem with that is what's easiest to measure, number one, is not always what's most important to measure. And number two, once we decide we're going to measure something, that's what we pay attention to. And so sometimes that ends up, we're measuring this thing that's easy to measure, and it's not really telling us what we need to know about our program. As you're answering questions about outcome and evaluation, you want to be really careful about checking definitions of the terms that are used by each funder, because I find that funders use different terms, and they use, sometimes outcome and goal are synonymous and sometimes they're not. Sometimes objective and outcome is synonymous and sometimes it's not. So you really have to be sure that you're using the terms that the funder is using. But really what you're getting at here is, how are you going to know that you've been successful? How are you going to know that this program is doing what it's supposed to be doing? How are you going to determine if you're off track? Outcomes can help you with all of that. I know that many foundations right now are starting to make some changes in terms of the way that they work with outcomes and evaluation. They're asking organizations to be more specific about what exactly is it that you are trying to measure, and why are you measuring that. CBERT has offered some workshops with Edgar Russell, who does a great job of talking about the way CBERT is approaching outcomes. Michelle, are those workshops are they being offered regularly, or are there recordings of them available? Do you know?
So generally we offer those when we're in the midst of a grant cycle. So
okay.
After someone has submitted and has an approved LOI, letter of inquiry, which is the first step in our process, We then invite them to participate in one of those workshops with Edgar prior to completing their application.
Awesome. Okay, great. Thank you.
You're
Yeah,
welcome.
so this is a huge area that we certainly don't have time to get into a lot of detail about it today, but there are, I think it's great that CBIRD is offering that resource. I know that was really helpful to me when I was working on a grant for one of my clients with CBIRD. And I know some other local foundations that are starting to do more in this area, but they also really are wanting to be helpful to the people who are getting funded. So don't be intimidated by this. I know sometimes it's frustrating. I'll be writing a grant that's for, $5,000 and they want to know what your evaluation plan is. And I think, oh, well, what, evaluation can cost money. It can cost money to run focus groups or whatever, but there are simpler ways to do evaluation as well. You can think about evaluation both quantitatively in terms of numbers, how many people have participated or benefited from something, but also qualitatively. And that's where sometimes the comments from your clients or the surveys you do can be helpful in that area. And then the last area that I want to talk about, and then we'll take a look at questions that we might have, and that is to look at funding considerations. So often on grants, you will have a question about this. They might ask who else is funding the program, or who have your top funders been in the last 3 years. Who do you expect your top funders to be next year? Generally, funders want assurances that you have other support. Very few funders are comfortable being your only or even your main source of support. They might be okay with that initially if it's a pilot program, and they might say, okay, that's fine, and we want to help you get off the ground. But usually there's a point where they want to see that you have some other support and that it's not just them, or they may want to see that they are becoming a smaller and smaller percentage of the support that you require in order to run your program. Funders might also want to know that you have a variety of types of support, so that, to be honest with you, if you are relying only on grant funding, that tends to be kind of a shaky way to fund an organization. I have clients that are very grant dependent, and the thing is, grants go away, and sometimes the grants don't get renewed, sometimes programs end, sometimes foundations sunset. And so, do you also have individual support? Do you have a revenue stream? Are you able to generate some income from the work that you do? Do you have some special event fundraising? Of course, that's taken a big hit in the pandemic, but there are organizations that have found creative ways of doing some of that fundraising online. So that's a question sometimes that funders have, is do you have some different types of support? And then if you're looking at a national funder, and I know boards of directors sometimes have a tendency to say, well, let's get a grant from the Ford Foundation, or let's go after the Rockefeller Foundation. It's probably not where you want to start in terms of looking for grant support. National funding is highly competitive, and national funders are going to want to know that you're supported in your own backyard. They want to know that you have local support as well. So usually going after national grants, I'm certainly not saying don't do it, but I would say that you want to be very careful about what kind of a program you would approach a national funder about. Sometimes we think we're doing something that's very innovative in our particular neck of the woods, but if you look nationally, maybe it's not so innovative, maybe it's been done a lot. So you want to be careful about that, because typically national grants are going to be a lot of time and effort and highly competitive. It's often way less than 1% of proposals that get funded. So you want to be sure that you're thinking about that as well. Okay, so we have about 10 minutes, which is just about what I was hoping we would have, Michelle. So do we have any questions?
We do have one so far, and
okay.
Where and how do you go looking for organizations that give grants? How can you find, or where do you find applications to fill out?
Okay, so this is a whole topic that I could spend lots and lots of time on, but let me at least give you a couple of ideas. I would suggest that workshop in November might be a good, a good idea as a starting place to find some more information that would be helpful to you. So a couple of ideas that I would have just kind of off the top of my head. One would be if you look at the websites of organizations that are similar to yours, maybe serve a similar demographic or provide a similar kind of program, you might want to look at their website and see if they have an annual report or some other information that shows who funds them. So if you find some foundations that fund a program similar to yours, they might be interested in funding yours as well. So that would be one thing you could do. The other thing is that there are foundation directories. There are both national and local ones. We are lucky. I don't know if the person asking the question is in Wisconsin, but Wisconsin has a really good foundation directory that's put out by Marquette University. And it is, you can purchase an online version of it. So then you can, which allows you to do searches by geography, as so what part, for instance, what part of the state you're in, and then by the type of program you offer, who you serve. Is it a youth program? Are you working with the prison population? Are you working with people with disabilities? It will allow you to filter that out, and then it will show you a profile of some prospective funders. That directory is also available through the Marquette Library. If you are in the Milwaukee area, the Marquette Library has a resource called a funding information center, and there actually are funding information centers all over the US. So if you're not in the Milwaukee area, if you Google funding information centers, you can find a list. I think there's between 300 and 400 in the US. Often they're in universities. And Marquette's was shut down for a long time because of COVID. They were not allowing people into the library, but they are now. So you could go to the Marquette Library and use their funding information center. You could use their foundation, their local directory, as well as their national directory. And that might help you to locate some of those potential funding sources. You can try Googling as well. I mean, you can Google kind of, grants for and try to get as specific as you can about the types of grants that you might be looking for your organization, and find some things online. But I really like using the directories because they do allow you to kind of narrow it down, and then you can look at individual foundations, and they will include information like, do they accept unsolicited requests? Some foundations don't, so there's no point in sending a proposal to them. And they'll also let you know, do they have a website? Do you send the application in through the mail? There's still lots of, especially smaller family foundations, that simply have you submit your application maybe in a letter format through the mail. But if you're able,
oh, go ahead. Did you want to?
I was just going to say, if you're able to join us on the 17th, we'll get into this in a lot more detail.
Yeah, and I wanted to mention too, on siebertfoundation.org, there is a button at the top that says Resource Center. And if you scroll all the way to the bottom under Siebert Research and Grantee Best Practices, we do have 4 links on there to other grant opportunities. One is a link to the Marquette Center that Sandra mentioned. Okay. We have a link to GuideStar, the Wisconsin Philanthropy Network, and Candid, which was formerly the Foundation Center. So those links are available in the Resource Center on siebertfoundation.org. And there's 2 other questions. One I think will be longer than another, so we'll do the quicker one first. Sandra, could you repeat the other website after census.gov where we can find data?
I think census.gov and Siebert were the 2 things that I mentioned. I mentioned the American Community Survey, but that's part of the census. So you will find the American Community Survey information at the census website.
Great, thank you. We have about 6 minutes left. We have 1 question right now. So if there's any other questions that someone would like to submit, just go ahead and do so. The last question we have is it okay to ask a funder why they did not fund you and ask for specifics?
So I'm going to give my answer, and then Michelle, maybe you'll have an answer to that as well. I would say it never hurts to ask. Sometimes you'll get a good response to that, and sometimes you may get an unsatisfying response. Often, the letter you get might be very, we had more requests than we could fulfill, and there's certainly some truth, there's truth to that. But sometimes it's hard to get the specifics about why a particular proposal wasn't funded. On the other hand, I have had situations where some funders will give you that kind of feedback and can be really helpful. Some grants even will share with you, if they've had a couple people review the proposal, they'll share with you the feedback that they got on the proposal. But just one other thing I would just encourage you to remember is that there's lots of things that go into deciding who gets funded. So sometimes within an organization, they want to fund a certain number of maybe youth programs, and your program might have ranked higher than somebody else's, but they already had funded, several programs that served the same demographic that you want to fund. I work with a Hmong agency in Milwaukee, and I'll be honest with you, I think there are some times when we get a leg up on some grants because nobody else has submitted a proposal that's serving the Hmong community in a particular area, and that becomes a benefit to us. So it's not always about the best written proposal. It's also about other things that the foundation might be balancing out. But as far as asking, I would say yes. So Michelle, how do you feel about getting those kind of calls?
Yes, so I am more than happy to have those conversations with applicants. There are certain conversations as part of our process that are confidential, that we obviously wouldn't share that type of information based on our decision-making process. But I will also say that we have a two-step process, which I think many foundations do, that starts with a letter of inquiry and then moves on to an application. And we really do our best to review those letters of inquiries carefully, so that if there are major things like what they're proposing doesn't align with one of our funding priorities or certain other parameters we have, we give that feedback at the LOI process and decline that LOI, so that we don't put the applicant through the entire application process and not fund them. That being said, there are applications that go through our process that don't get funded, and I'm very happy to have that conversation and provide constructive feedback to applicants. But again, there are certain parts of our process that will be confidential, but we try to be helpful as we can.
I actually I like the fact that you have a two-step process. I prefer that. And I'm always really glad when funders do that, because it doesn't waste our time then either. Exactly.
We have one more question, and Sandra, you work with so many organizations, and the question is CBERT typical or atypical in encouraging group grant writing and inclusive work planning?
I would say that I see more of that within the foundation community, more movement kind of in that more collaborative direction. I think it's kind of one of the trends. But it's certainly not, it's certainly by no means universal.
Great, thank you. So those are all of the questions that we have submitted for now, which puts us ending right on time. One thing I want to mention to the group is that we do have a chat area on the conference website. So when you close out of this and you get back to the main conference website, up in your upper right-hand corner, you'll see Launch Chat. In there, we have different group chats, and you can also direct message other attendees. And there is a specific group chat for grant writing. So Sandra, you'll have a chance to stop by there, and if not, that's okay. But attendees session can share important things they took away from your presentation, chat with other attendees, maybe provide insight to someone who didn't attend this session but is curious about what the content was. So I encourage all of you to please stop by there and enjoy the rest of the conference. We're blessed to have you here today.
Thanks, Michelle.
Yeah. All right, goodbye, everybody. I'm going to end the session for now. Take care.